And welcome to the Master Gardener program on managing public trees and spaces for wildlife. I'm Dina Henshin, Head of Adult Services at Percival Library, and your host today. Please feel free to send me your comments and questions during the program by using the chat feature, and I will relay them to Marnie during and at the end of the program. Marnie Titchenell is the Extension Wildlife Program Director with The Ohio State University. She works within the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. She provides a variety of educational programs, workshops, conferences, and publications centered on wildlife ecology and biology, habitat management for wildlife, and managing nuisance wildlife species. Welcome, Marnie.
Thank you, Dina. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I know I'm coming in from quite a few states away, but I was very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. I was invited to talk a little bit about managing trees and public spaces for wildlife. So just to give you a little bit of a background on me and where I'm coming from, I do have a degree in wildlife and forestry from OSU. For my graduate degree, I studied bat populations in the forests of Southern Ohio. Now, as an extension educator, I focus a lot of my outreach around forest wildlife, but more and more I have been focusing on urban wildlife and creating habitat within the communities that we live in. And I did a presentation several months ago on this topic, and I believe maybe one of your master gardeners attended and thought that I could speak for you all as well. So again, thank you for the invitation. So this picture that you've been looking at is one that I first encountered during a presentation given by one of my former instructors, actually, Amanda Rodewald, who is now a director at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And she used this image, this is of Central Park in New York City, during a presentation on songbird use of urban areas. And I thought it was a very impactful visual of the importance of green spaces in more developed areas. It's a little stark, of course, but it really, really portrays from a bird's eye view how important these green spaces are. Now, before I get started too much further, everything that you see here today, the slides, any resources that I refer to, plant lists that I will give you, and I will give you quite a few, and you will not have time to write everything down. But that's why I'm providing you all of these slides in a downloadable PDF, as well as anything else that I mentioned here today, websites, etc. And it will be at this link that, thank you, Dina, just popped up into the chat box. And if you search for the article Managing Trees and Public Spaces for Wildlife, which is not hard to do, you could just type in any one of those keywords, it'll pop up and you'll see all of those resources. Okay, so let's get into it. And just so we're all on the same page, one of the areas we will be talking about today are urban green spaces. And so when I say that, what I really mean is a piece of land with vegetation in it in an urban area, right? So this could be any number of things. It could be parks, gardens, but it can also be an urban forest or an urban forest patch. And so urban forest is often used when we refer to trees in a city or a community. That would include like the street trees, trees in parks, or within our yards. Oftentimes it have a more manicured look. But then the urban forest also includes any more natural or wooded spaces within our communities and the places that we live. Those that have more in common with our larger, more rural forests. And so these areas are sometimes referred to as those urban forest patches or city forests, as I said earlier. So today we're going to be focusing on these areas. And we're also going to be, a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today when we talk about managing trees and managing these urban forest patches can also be very applicable to any of you that own private property. If any of you are forest landowners, a lot of these ideas and the plant lists, for example, that I'll share with you will hopefully be useful to you as well. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that if you're someone that doesn't really live in an urban space. First, I want to have a little conversation about the importance of connecting with nature. And I'm sure you all can relate, especially as you are all master gardeners. Um, or if you're not, you obviously have an interest in nature. You wouldn't have signed in here today. But how many of you have kind of maybe you spent a day indoors and then you have finally a chance to get outside? Or maybe you spent the day outside gardening or hiking or birding, and even though you may have worked hard and it's the end of the day and you're tired, you still feel satisfied and refreshed. You feel good for having that time outside. There's actually a word for that. Does anybody know what it is? I don't know if you all are comfortable typing things into the chat, but if you are, feel free. So a word for that desire to connect with nature. And it doesn't matter if we're experiencing nature in our own backyards or if we're traveling to a park or some other space. So that word is actually biophilia. It's that feeling of satisfaction, refreshment, renewed focus from having time spent outdoors. So unfortunately, the average American spends 90% of their time indoors, and that's according to the Natural Resources Defense Council. Yet we still have this innate human instinct to connect with nature and to connect with other living things. And if you're wondering, that's a picture of my daughter holding a tiny toad that had just completed metamorphosis. And you can see her joy in that picture. So being outside is good for us. It's good for our health. It supports cognitive function, physical health, psychological well-being. And we all need that, more of that, right? So that love of life, that of living things, that is biophilia. It's the connection to the biodiversity of the planet. And unfortunately, biodiversity is in trouble. We're losing it, right? And that's the very basis of human survival and economic well-being. Biodiversity encompasses all life forms, ecosystems, and ecological processes. So this graph that you're looking at is showing the number of species that we have lost in the last 500 years by animal categories. Now, these are extinctions. These animals are gone. But unfortunately, there are many other examples of populations of wildlife species that are declining. For example, if you've heard of this research, 3 million birds have been lost since 1970. We're experiencing significant declines in many of our bird populations, and not just a single group, of like species, but across the board declines, as you can see from these statistics. We are concerned about an iconic butterfly, the monarch, possibly being added to the endangered species list. We talk about declines of the rusty patched bumblebee and other native bees, which are really the powerhouses when it comes to pollinating not just our native plants, but many of the plants that we eat and depend on. Here in Ohio, we have over 450 native bees, and most folks don't know much about them. They know that they're out there, but as I said, they're really doing a lot of work when it comes to pollinating our native plants. And just to pull in another one of my species that's near and dear to my heart are colonial bats that hibernate in underground caves and mines over the winter, have suffered massive declines due to an invasive non-native fungus that causes the disease white nose syndrome. And the northern long-eared bat, who you see here on the right, and this is a bat that is infected with white nose syndrome, and you can see the fungus on its face and its ears and its little wing there. They have recently been listed as endangered, federally endangered, due to this. And many states are adding this species and several others to their state endangered lists as a result of this disease. So when we ask the question of, what is causing these declines, the number one cause is habitat loss and or degradation. Now, it's closely followed by non-native invasive species, pathogens, and in the case of our aquatic life, overhunting and overexploitation. Now, we know that habitat loss and degradation can take many forms, right? Sometimes it's the result of, or oftentimes it's the result of us and how we are changing and using the landscape. waiting for my computer. There we go. So how are we using the landscape? This is a lovely graphic from Bloomberg. It's a little outdated. Apologies for that, but I haven't been able to find a more updated one, and I think it still holds true. So the placement of each land cover type doesn't obviously represent solely where it's taking place, but the size of each of those different colors does represent how much of our land is dedicated to that use. So you can kind of see how they compare to one another. So take a look at that and take a guess at which land cover type you think is growing the fastest. Oh, I already have it up there. That was my computer getting ahead of me now. So urban growth is outpacing growth of all other land use categories. Sorry about that. Just to give you some perspective, it is growing about 1 million acres per year, which is about the size of LA, Houston, and Phoenix combined. So it really is growing fast, even though as you look at that graph, it's not making up one of the largest categories, but that may change in time. So some of you might be thinking, well, no wonder we're losing habitat left and right with how we're using the landscape. And you'd be right, that is true. But I like to flip the narrative a little bit and talk about the fact that 82% of our population is living in more developed spaces along the fringes or within urban areas, for example, and that is not slowing down anytime soon. So what can we do? Well, maybe we can start focusing on improving those developed spaces where we live and where our communities are for wildlife, for our biophilia, and for that connection with nature. And there's a lot of potential to do this. And as I've already said, we want to connect with nature. And as we look at how we are connecting with nature as far as recreationally, we see that non-consumptive uses of wildlife, like wildlife watching, feeding birds, photography, these have all been growing in popularity, especially within developed spaces and on our own property. There are city governments and residents that are championing their small urban forests and looking for ways to improve them and ecosystem health. This is all great, and we want more of this to be happening. And as for those of you out there, if any of you are managers of public spaces, understanding how people want to enjoy wildlife and their natural resources is really important, especially when it comes to public buy-in for certain projects, which can really help to generate support and funding towards some of these habitat management initiatives and urban forestry. On the private landowner side of things, there is also a growing demand for this ecological landscaping and gardening, which is essentially gardening that supports us and what we like to see, but also supports the ecosystem in the same place and the same time. Now, we've talked about mental and physical well-being that can be derived from spending time in nature, but what about some of the other ecosystem services that we can reap? This is especially important in light of our changing climate. So urban forests can provide really critical ecosystem services. These smaller patches within our developed spaces are a lot of times overlooked, but they can provide benefits that are often out of proportion with their size because they're serving millions of people that are living within these more developed spaces. We're talking about flood regulation, improved air quality, of course, habitat for wildlife, climate resiliency when it comes to carbon storage, and they're also critical when it comes to heat mitigation. And so this is some work from Wang and others out of China that reported that the cooling effect within green spaces and the cooling effect that they have within urban areas can really help with the urban heat island effect. And this is a widely recognized phenomenon that really affects the quality of life for some of our urban citizens. And what's interesting is I think we all know that more trees can provide more shade and more cooling effects. But what these authors found is that when you have a diversity of different tree species in an area, that's going to provide even more cooling to the area. And that really just goes back to differences between our trees. Some leaf out earlier, some maintain their leaves longer, and other characteristics of those trees that really increase that cooling effect. So let's talk about the wildlife in our developed spaces. You know, we talk about how it's important to have trees, it's important to have these forest patches, it's important to manage for forests, but what about supporting wildlife? Can these spaces actually support wildlife? And surprisingly, cities can be critical for native biodiversity conservation. Wildlife is present in even the most populated of cities, and some species, like the coyote that you see here, most of them are largely undetected, while others we are much more familiar with, and still other species. But sometimes we're afforded, not here, some really special moments when it comes to sharing our spaces with urban wildlife. So they can be really important places to not only conserve that biodiversity, but to really have these moments to enjoy these species and enjoy coexisting with them. And just to give you a few more examples, we've learned through research that smaller forest patches can be really important to our migratory songbirds, especially in the spring and fall as stopover sites to rest and to refuel. We know that humans and bees, and not just honeybees, but our native bees that we mentioned earlier, have a positive relationship, and that when they live with us, when there are more people, more of us planting a diversity of flowering plants, there are more bees and more bee species. And we know that bats forage in a variety of spaces, including our backyards, and we can also provide for them by planting native plants that attract insects and support healthy and diverse forest patches where they can find roost trees like you see here. And that roost tree on the left, that was a tree used for quite a few years by a maternity colony of Indiana bats. So maternity colony, meaning the females gathered together to birth and raise their pups over the summer. And that was essentially in Columbus, which is a highly populated area, but was in one of our metro parks. So very important green space. So where do we start? Where do we start with all this? We know that we are wanting to connect with nature. There's great potential to look to our communities to do that. And we know that some of our wildlife species will respond. So let's start with a reminder that when we attract wildlife, we need to provide habitat throughout the year and to account for changing needs. So as we're looking at this beautiful little picture of an eastern bluebird, when we want to provide for that species, we need to think about the habitat needs and how they're going to change. For example, if we think about just food, we need to know that this species likes insects during the summer, and they like to hunt for those insects in more open spaces. But when winter hits, if they do not migrate, they need shrubs that are going to provide berries and other foods to get them through the winter. But we know that habitat is not just food, it's cover, it's water, and it's the space for them to find all of those resources as well as mates to help ensure survival. So we need to also know that bluebirds need cavities in trees. And if we don't have those, then they need something that mimics those natural cavities, like bluebird boxes. This is my favorite picture that I took of a bluebird. She was so busy building her nest that she did not even hear me approach. So again, this is just important to remember as we move forward. We're going to be speaking a little bit more generally about providing habitat for wildlife. But if you really want a specific species, you need to take a little bit of a deeper dive like this to really figure out what they need and if you can provide it. So for today, in the interest of time, we're going to be focusing on managing trees and shrubs in the areas that we've already discussed. And we're going to be talking about them on two levels. On the more manicured levels, so those plants that we can incorporate into streets, our parks, our backyards, around our home landscapes, and places like that. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion about different ways that we can manage urban forest patches. And for those of you that may be private forest landowners, those areas would really, or those discussions are really going to apply to you as well. So as I said earlier, I'm going to be giving you a lot of plant lists today. So another reminder that they will be posted on that link that Dina shared with you at the beginning, and it's still in the chat box. I also realize that I am in Ohio and you're in Virginia, and that we have different plant hardiness zones. But a lot of the plants that I'm going to be sharing with you are by genus, so you should be able to find a species that grows well in your area, always remembering the right plant, right place mantra. Now, onto this quote. So Arison and others say that the retention of native vegetation is an effective strategy to conserve biodiversity in urban areas and also in more natural spaces. So let's talk a little bit about native vegetation and non-native vegetation. You may be on one side or the other, maybe you're in the middle. I like to recommend plants that support healthy ecosystems. So that means plants that are going to support a diverse food web, which then work to create a stable and healthy ecosystem, right? Now, these plants tend to be native plants, and that's simply because our wildlife have developed relationships over many years with these native plants. And so it's the native plants that are largely going to support these healthy ecosystems. That said, there are certainly some non-native plants that also provide resources to wildlife. And there are some non-native plants that we enjoy growing and we enjoy having around, and that's fine. I don't believe that this is a black and white issue. But if the area that you are managing is specifically for wildlife, then you do want the majority of plants in that area to be native. Now, some of you are numbers people. Something you may want to aim for is about 30% of your plant biomass should be non-natives if managing for wildlife and supporting a healthy ecosystem is one of your objectives on your property, right? And then the rest should be native. But we definitely want to avoid the non-native invasive plants, right? Those plants that we know can cause issues and have negative impacts, like honeysuckle, you see here in this picture, tree heaven, garlic mustard, buckthorn, privet, the list goes on, right? And it's important to realize that sometimes the non-native invasive plants outsmart the wildlife. Bush honeysuckle, for example, does an amazing job at this. It does everything it should be doing to attract birds to come and eat these bright, abundant, shiny berries. And the birds do, right? But we know that these berries are not as nutritious as the berries our native plants are providing. It's essentially like fast food for the birds. But unfortunately, the birds don't realize that. They continue to eat the seeds and then spread them across the landscape with a little bit of fertilizer, right? So we have to be smart for the birds, help them out, and remove these non-native invasive plants. So many people are working very hard to educate folks on non-native invasive plants. And I'm sure you all have heard this before. And maybe you're already working to plant natives and to remove and replace non-native species. And maybe you're talking to your neighbors about it too. If you are, kudos. I did want to share this resource with you. This was developed by the Ohio Invasive Plant Council. So again, pay attention to the plant hardiness zones. But I really like this publication because it lists in orange there the non-native invasive plant, and then in green, recommended alternatives. So if you're looking to swap out some of those non-native invasive species, it gives you some good alternatives. This is also a great resource to hand to a neighbor that maybe doesn't know as much about it. The other resource that I will mention is the Center for Invasive Species Ecosystem Health. And that is out of the University of Georgia, and they address national issues concerning non-native invasive species. So a wonderful resource if you want to learn more about these plants and insects and different ways to combat them. And that a link to their website is in that article that we shared at the beginning of the presentation. Okay, so let's get back to our discussion about which plants we can incorporate into our more manicured landscapes or within your property if you're looking to provide habitat for both birds and pollinators. So we talk about plants that provide berries and will support birds like our cedar waxwing, which is a berry specialist. We talk about plants that are going to attract insects, especially caterpillars. And here we see a black-capped chickadee with a caterpillar in its mouth. And then I will give you plants that will produce seeds and nuts for our birds, that will produce pollen and nectar for our birds and our pollinators. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about some plants that provide cover as well. So let's get into it. Now we're going to start with a little bit of a discussion on our caterpillars and some nectar and pollen resources. And I'm going to focus on butterflies and moths. And I think when we think about providing habitat for those two animals, something like this that you see on the left is the image that we often get in our mind, right? A diverse planting of native wildflowers. And you'd be exactly right. This is providing lots of resources for our butterflies and our moths, as well as our other pollinators, our bees, of course, as well. But let's remember that our trees, our forests offer incredibly valuable habitat, especially as host plants. And if you don't know what a host plant is, that is the plant that the female butterfly or moth lays her egg on. So I just want to pause here and give a brief shout out to moths. I don't think they get nearly as much attention as our butterflies. Some of them, though, are very beautifully colored, very diverse. We have many more species of moths than we do butterflies. And it's a group that you should pay attention to, especially if you are wanting to promote habitat for our birds and other wildlife species. They're a critical, moth caterpillars in particular, are a critical food source for our birds. So this is a new book from Jim McCormick and Chelsea Gottfried, two folks that work here in Ohio. If you have not checked it out, it's amazing. It's a regional guide, so some of it should apply for you as well in Virginia, but it's just a wonderful read. The pictures are gorgeous. It's where I learned about this rosy maple moth, which I think is just about the cutest moth I've ever seen. And before this book, I never would have said that moths were cute, but now I say they're cute. But you can see that this moth is very bright and brilliantly colored, and their host plants are maples. They'll use beech and oaks and sycamore as well, but they really like maples. And if you're lucky, you might see them nestled among maple samaras. And they emerged, the moths emerged about the same time as maple samaras. So wonderful example of camouflage and phonology at its best. So I will leave it there, but thanks to this book, I now have to examine every cluster of maple samaras that I see, so I never get where I'm going outside very fast. Now, many of our host plants for moths are woody, and this pairs, of course, very well with our discussion today on shrubs and trees, and the same can be said for quite a few of our butterflies as well. So, for example, we have 3 plants here that are host plants to 3 different butterflies. So let's just review them. And maybe you recognize this leaf right here. This is our American elm. And if you've never seen the flowers of American elm, they're probably not noticed too often. They are wind pollinated, but I think they're very beautiful in their own way. So elms are the host plant of this prickly looking caterpillar, which if you were to touch that caterpillar, nothing would happen. It's all bluff. But the same cannot be said for all caterpillars, right? So never touch a caterpillar if you don't know what it is. Some of them can pack a pretty significant sting. But this caterpillar grows up to be the eastern comma, one of our punctuation butterflies, as I call them. And as I said, they will use elms, and they'll also use nettle as well as their host plant. That next plant, maybe you recognize that flower. It's very tulip looking. That would be our tulip flower. Tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, yellow poplar, some people call it. And it is a host plant for this caterpillar, which grows up to be the eastern tiger swallowtail. And this beautiful butterfly, which very commonly visits backyard butterfly gardens from the forest, will also use cherry and plum and birch as well as host plants. And then last but not least, we have hawthorn, which is a wonderful wildlife plant for both birds and pollinators and other critters that will eat the berries. But it is also the host plant for this interesting looking caterpillar, which is a bird poop mimic. You can kind of see that with the coloration. Really good strategy if you're a caterpillar, right? To look like a bird poop. And it grows up to be my favorite butterfly, which is the beautiful red spotted purple butterfly. And along with hawthorn, this butterfly will also use your cherry and plum, the prunus, and the oaks, and also our amelanchier, or our serviceberry. So overall, our woody plants host an impressive number of caterpillars, and we can use this to our advantage, right? We can choose caterpillar-loving plants to incorporate into the landscape. Because our birds out there, you need a lot of caterpillars to support one single nest. For example, this black-capped chickadee needs to collect about 5,000 to 6,000 caterpillars just to raise one nest of chickadees. So let's help our feathered parents out a bit and start providing some of these caterpillar-loving plants. So along with oaks, willow, cherry, plum, birch, maple, and hickory are some of the top plant genera that support these caterpillars. And if you're looking for some herbaceous suggestions, goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, and wild strawberries are wonderful in supporting caterpillars as well. So these lists were developed by research from Doug Tallamy and his graduate students. Doug Tallamy is a professor and researcher with the University of Delaware, and this is kind of his work. This is what he really specializes in, is looking at these connections between wildlife and native plants. So if you've not heard of him before, I highly encourage you to check out a webinar that he's given. You can find them on YouTube. You can also find them at this link. And he's written several really wonderful books that I would recommend reading as well if this topic interests you. So here's a slightly larger list of trees and shrubs for pollinators. And we haven't been talking much about bees, but of course we know that our bees need pollen and nectar. And some of our trees are really important resources for them, especially some of our early season bees. That, they're emerging when our herbaceous plants aren't putting out nectar or pollen yet. And so they're going to trees and shrubs to find those resources. For those of you that are managing park areas, or even those of you that own woodlands and you want to create a dedicated space for pollinators and you want to get some of those native flowers in there, situating those gardens close to the woods is a wonderful thing to do, because you're going to be pulling out those woodland bees and those woodland lepidopterans, or butterflies and moths. They're going to come out of the woods where they're finding their host plants and other resources and utilize your butterfly garden. So sometimes orienting these different plantings across the landscape and giving some thought to that is really important. Here's a little bonus, something that maybe we don't talk about enough. Research has shown that landscapes, so now we're kind of talking about, landscaping around our home, like you see in that picture on the left. And this would apply to our forests as well, honestly. But when we have greater native plant diversities, they're going to be more stable and they're going to suffer less outbreaks from pest insects. And that is because when you're increasing plant diversity, you're also going to be attracting not just pollinators, but some of these insect predators like soldier beetles, like lady beetles. Here you see the 7-spotted lady beetle, right? These are insects, as well as mantids and spiders, that are feasting on other insects and really helping to keep that ecosystem stable from the top down, right? And we can oftentimes, if we are incorporating some of those native perennials, your asters and coneflowers and goldenrods that we talk about a lot, you're naturally going to get those insect predators in. But you can also pick and choose as well. And especially when it comes to our woody trees and shrubs, or trees and shrubs, we know that there are some plants that are particularly good at attracting these insect predators. And one of the reasons they're good at it is because they're offering them a little treat, or a little dessert, as you could say. So my colleague, Joe Boggs, who is another extension educator and also an entomologist, says that nectar is the currency used by plants to pay insects and other animals to do their bidding. We know that, right? When we think about bees and pollination, but this can also apply to our insect predators. And what you're looking at right there in this picture, and hopefully you all can see my pointer, is right here and right here. These are what are called extrafloral nectaries. So these little glands are producing nectar, not from a flower, but at the base of this chokecherry leaf. And so what this plant is essentially saying to the insect predators is that, hey, this is a payment system. You take care of those insects that eat me, and I'll give you them and this dessert afterwards. So kind of a cool relationship. And then, of course, on the right of your screen, you see a list of some plants as well as woody plants that offer that extra sweet treat. And there is a lovely picture of an ant taking advantage of that sweet nectar. So if you're familiar with ants and peonies, it's the same type of thing. The peony is putting out fluids that are attracting those ants and keeping them there so it can those ants can defend against those other insect pests. Oh, and I see that I have a animation, sorry, out of order. So it's covering some of those. Apologies for that. But in the slides, it's not there. So you'll be able to have that whole plant list. But here we're moving on to some plants that provide some nuts and seeds. On the left, I have trees, and on the right, that's partially covered, are some herbaceous options. And so the pictures on the right kind of coordinate with the bolded letters. So we have oak, we have our birch, which provides some lovely seeds for our finches as well as other birds. And then on the bottom, we have our asters, which is a great one to get out there for not just pollen and nectar for, you can see monarchs from that picture, but also for the seeds that it produces later. Now, if you have some of these herbaceous plants, and goldenrod would be another one that's covered up there, as well as a few others. Ironweed, I believe. Bergamot would be another great one. But if you have these planted around your property, and one thing to kind of consider doing is to leave them standing into the fall and even into the winter, because they are providing this seed source, and birds that don't migrate and stick around during the winter are going to take advantage of that seed source. So it's my excuse to be a lazy landscaper. I leave those plants standing. Actually, I leave them standing until the spring, and then I do what you're looking at in this picture. I cut back the stems that are really kind of woody and have the soft inside or a hollow inside. I leave about a foot or two standing, and then those spaces are available to some of our native stem nesting bees. Moving on to a list of berries for birds. If you have the space, pick and choose, or if you don't have the space, you can really pick and choose some of these plants that are really going to provide berries for these birds. If you do have the space, choosing some that maybe produce earlier in the year, like our serviceberry, choosing some that produce towards the middle to late end of the year, like our elderberry, some of our rubus, but then also incorporating some of those plants in blue that are known to hold on to berries going into the winter. And for those plants, you might think, well, the birds don't really like to eat them because those apples or those chokecherry berries are still there, or I'm sorry, the hackberry berries are still there. But sometimes these berries need to go through a freeze and thaw cycle before they're even palatable to the birds. Either way, it's an important food source for these birds during the winter when they really need them. And since we're also talking about forest patches, and some of you may be forest landowners, let's not forget about our woodland vines. Some of the three most common woodland vines, at least here in Ohio, also produce berries that the birds love. So our grapevines, our Virginia creeper, and the one on the right there is actually poison ivy. So it produces these white berries towards the end of the year that the birds love. So for some of these grapevines in particular, sometimes grapevines can be detrimental to trees. So depending on what your management objectives are, you might decide to remove grapevines from trees that are maybe meeting another management goal, like maybe they're providing nuts and berries for wildlife or some other tree that you value, but then choosing to leave grapevines on some other trees that aren't providing the resources that you're wanting. Here are a few publications that are going to be really great for those of you that are interested in supporting birds in forest patches, both big and small. So we're going to kind of transition into a discussion about some things that we can do in larger forest patches for wildlife, for birds, for pollinators, and a little bit for bats. Okay, so both of these resources are going to be great depending on if you're managing a smaller patch or a larger patch. And they're both linked on the link we shared, but you can also get them at that link on the screen. So I'm going to be focusing on some of the recommendations from the small patch guide as we're talking more about some public spaces in developed areas today. And one of our major challenges these days, no matter where the forest is, in all honesty, is our non-native invasive species. Many of these species are going to invade the forest understory. They're going to allow little to no regeneration on the forest floor of our native species, which essentially means that you're really disrupting your future forest. Now, the bright side is that according to the USDA's Forest Service Urban Field Station, they report that across the northeastern US, many of our urban forest patches are dominated by native trees in the canopy. So that's good. We just need to make sure that those native trees are able to provide seed and regeneration to maintain that future forest. And so working to really remove that shrub layer of invasives that often forms in our urban forests is a really critical and important step. So these first two bullet points are something that we're always working for, and we try to check off right away, right? So next, we can take a closer look at the vertical structure within a forest. And what I mean by that is if you're standing within the forest in one spot, you look down at your feet and all the way up towards the canopy, you should see a diversity of layers, or vertical structure as we call it. So having a defined ground cover, shrub layer, mid-story layer is going to be very attractive to wildlife, specifically to birds, right? Our birds partition the habitat vertically, and they do this to avoid competition with one another. It's why we see ovenbirds nesting and foraging on the forest floor, why we see vireos higher up in the canopy, and why we see our gray catbirds, for example, in that middle kind of stratification. So how do we create this vertical structure if it's lacking in a forest patch? There's different ways to do that, but it really is all about the light, right? It's about the amount of light that you're allowing to reach to that forest floor that is going to encourage growth and regeneration. And how you open up the canopy can change depending on the forest patch that you're looking at. But always remember, we want to control non-native invasive plants first, because if we have them on the forest floor and we open up the canopy and allow more light, they're just going to grow even more. So again, removing those non-native invasive species needs to happen first. And then we can, depending on your management goals and what your forest patch looks like, you can do different things. Maybe you can create small canopy gaps. And in areas where you have larger patches of contiguous forest, this is a great strategy. Opening up the canopy to create those little regenerative areas. This is also a practice we commonly do for deer and turkey to provide some different habitat and some other foraging grounds for them. Crop tree release is another strategy which deals with identifying crop trees, which is the tree that you want to promote. Maybe it's an oak, a mast producing species. And you talk about opening up the canopy around that oak so that crown receives more sunlight and increases in its growth and increases in the mast or the fruit that it's providing. And so as you're releasing that crown, you're also creating canopy gaps and allowing more light to hit the forest floor. And let me go back for a second, that strategy also allows for the creation of snags or dead standing trees, which is something we're going to talk about here shortly. So this is a program that I am involved with, and I'm sharing knowing that you live in Virginia, I'm still sharing this with you because we do a series of webinars that might interest you and that don't just apply to Ohio. And so you can find those under resources and webinars, but you can also find a series of fact sheets on non-native invasive species, how to identify them and how to control them under our publications tab. Okay, let's talk about enhancing connectivity between patches. And this is something that we always want to work towards. Generally speaking, the more forest cover that is available in the landscape surrounding a forest patch, the more functional that individual forest patch is going to be for wildlife. So you all in Virginia are fortunate to have quite a bit of forest land. And so the ability to make some pretty significant impacts on wildlife. Here in Ohio, part of our state has some pretty good patches of contiguous forest, but we have all half of our state that is scattered patches of forest land in heavily developed and a heavily developed and agricultural landscape. So we talk a lot about connectivity, but I'm sure there's still some spaces in Virginia, in urban spaces, where that connectivity can really be important to kind of facilitate the movement of wildlife across the landscape. So we talk about, windbreaks and corridors, hedgerows and field borders and more open areas. And then last, but certainly not least, we talk about deadwood. And this is an incredibly important feature when it comes to our wildlife, and not just birds and pollinators and bats, as we've been talking about, but lots of different species. So here we see a pileated woodpecker pecking into a dead log, no doubt looking for carpenter ants, one of their big food sources. But I love this quote: "A single tree in a natural forest serves thousands of other organisms, even once it has been dead for decades." So the value of a tree does not decline once it is dead or dying. It just starts a new life. And just so we're all on the same page, when I say deadwood, I'm talking about dead standing trees, which we call snags, live trees that might have cavities or other dead features, and then dead woody debris, which would be a brush pile or even logs on the forest floor. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of deadwood. You can see the importance to all of these species here, to our cavity nesting pollinators and bees. Raptors use dead standing trees as perches and homes. Mammals like flying squirrels and bats will use them at cavities in trees or spaces under bark. Small mammals, snakes, turtles, amphibians will use downwoods on the forest floor for shelter and to look for food. So incredibly important resources. There's really no known optimal number of the amount of deadwood to have in a forest. But if your goal is to attract wildlife, then leave as much as you can, right? Your decision on what species to leave and how much should also incorporate your other management goals and objectives that you have with your property. And also realize that if you're managing for a diverse forest with multiple ages, this deadwood creation is going to happen naturally. You can also create snags if you're walking through a forest patch or your forest and you're just not seeing much downwood. You're not seeing very many dead standing trees. You can create them. This fact sheet can guide you through the different techniques that you can use to do that. And then on a more backyard side of things, this is a wonderful guide by Xerces, and it will give you lots of different ways on how to utilize dead wood to provide nesting and overwintering habitat to pollinators and other beneficial insects. So to kind of wrap things up, we want to manage for healthy and diverse forest patches that are well connected across the landscape. Always remembering that diversity is key. We want to manage those non-native invasive species, and we want to work to provide those key resources that our wildlife are looking for: variety of hard and soft mast and dead wood. So in conclusion, I'll leave you with just 3 parting thoughts. Here's the first one. Our urban spaces are their own ecosystems, and we're still learning a lot about them, a lot about the wildlife that's living in them and how they're interacting with us and each other. So for example, we know that our birds are challenged by lights in our city. They're challenged by buildings, especially when they're built mostly of glass and are very reflective. And so there's some negatives to this. And so we're looking at initiatives. We're working with cities here in Ohio to have less lighting in these urban areas. So Ohio Lights Out is a program that's working on that. We can also help to keep birds safe from these collisions around our homes as well, because 50% of bird strikes happen at our own home windows. Think about it another way. We don't let our dogs run free in our backyards without a fence or some other barrier to keep them protected and from running out into the road. So let's start thinking about birds in the same way. Let's protect them from dangers around our home. And so we can apply things to our windows to break up that reflection and make the birds realize, oh, that's not an extension of the habitat. I'm going to stop and not collide with this window. And so there's lots of different things that you can do. This link will give you lots of options. My favorite are the feather-friendly dots that you see in that picture right here on the left. And let's think about the kind of lighting we're using. We know that certain species of bats as well avoid lights. So this is information from Dark Sky, an organization that works to advance responsible outdoor lighting that will have less of an impact on wildlife and on us. My second parting thought is that we need to note the reality of habitat creation. When we create habitat to attract wildlife, we also run the risk of attracting conflict. And if there's too much conflict, if this raccoon stuck in the house is the only thing a person experiences with wildlife, then they're going to be less likely to want to conserve areas and maybe provide habitat on their own property. So we need to realize that and share resources. Realize that there are strategies that you can take to prevent and lessen conflict from wildlife. So I have resources on my blog. Check those out, and I highly encourage you to reach out to your Department of Natural Resources, as I'm sure they have information as well. And then last but not least, it's really important to find that balance of attracting wildlife and dealing with that wildlife conflict, because it's so worth it when we do, because we can connect with wildlife. We connect with nature. We foster that connection in our youth, and we inspire conservation. So my backyard patch of milkweed is where my two daughters first experienced holding a monarch butterfly for the first time. You see my oldest there then had the opportunity to share that experience with her sister, who was just as excited. And I love that they didn't have to travel far to have this experience. They just had to go out their own back door. And so for many people, it's these community spaces, it's their own backyards, their own properties, where they get these firsthand experiences with wildlife. And that is a very powerful role that our backyards and that our community spaces can play. So my thanks to all of you for all that you are doing to promote and conserve wildlife on your properties, in your communities. And I thank you for listening today. Here's my contact information and that link once again, and just a few more reminders of how healthy it is to get outside. So thank you for being inside to listen to me. Afterwards, I hope you can get some outside time.
I have a couple questions for you, Marnie, if you're
Sure.
up for it.
Yes, of course.
Thank you for the fantastic presentation. We have a question. Do you have any strategies or resources for convincing local governments or HOAs to use more native plants in their landscaping?
Oh, that is a big challenge. Yeah. I think we just need to talk about it more. I think those folks living within those communities need to be loud so they're heard. I think they need to get involved on those homeowner associations. They need to play a role in it, and they need to start talking a little bit more about it, because it's hard to get folks to listen otherwise if you're not involved and you're not participating. So that's kind of been my vote, my vote. And I see it a lot here in Ohio, and I get that question a lot. I think there's lots of resources out there online. There's lots of webinars like tonight and from other folks that have way more experience than I do in this topic, that we can share with these leaders and start to turn that tide. And it is happening. We have more interest in ecological scaping. That's evidenced, at least here in Ohio, by the fact that we're starting to be able to find native plants in nurseries more often. So I think it's starting. We just need to keep talking about it, and we need to kind of push our way into some of those organizations that make those decisions.
Okay. Another question person says, great lecture, slides and links. Look forward to exploring them. I did not see witch hazel mentioned. Thoughts of
Mhm.
importance for early spring pollinators.
Yes, witch hazel is a wonderful one for our early spring pollinators, for sure. Yes, and I did not leave that out for any other reason than I just didn't have enough room. But I love witch hazel. It's a great one.
Can only put so much in.
I know. There's so many good ones.
I got several thank yous and we appreciate your presentation, but I think
You're
our
so welcome.
questions are, I think I don't have any more questions.
All right.
I wanted to let everybody know that I am recording this lecture and it will be on the Loudoun County Public Library YouTube channel. And it will also get sent out to the Master Gardener group. And meet us back here next month for our continuing Master Gardener online series. Thank you again, Marnie. It was a great presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.